Okay, what we're doing here is called the partition method, and what it does is it takes a value called pivot, places it in the array so that all the values that come before it are less than that, and the values that come after it are greater than it. To start out, we will initialize a variable called pivot, which for today we'll be initializing to the first variable value, in the array, which is 5. Next, we will be initializing a variable called pointer to 0, or to the start of the array, and that will help keep track of where we are in the array and where to place pivot at the very end. To help us iterate through the array, we'll be using a for loop with an index starting at the second value in the array. That will help us compare all the numbers to each other. To go through the for loop, we will be looking at the index, the value at the index compared to pivot, and switching them when the value at index is less than pivot. Okay. So to start out, we look at the value at index compared to the value of pivot. If it is less than pivot, we would increment pointer and swap pointer with index, but it is not. So in this case, we will be going on to the next iteration. So we look, the value at index is indeed less than the value of pivot, so we will be incrementing pointer, swapping the value of pointer with the value at index, and then moving on to the next iteration. The value at index is less than pivot, increment pointer, swap value of pointer with index. Move on. The value at index is not less than the value of pivot, so we'll move on to the next iteration. Now, the value at index is less than pivot, so we increment pointer, swap the value at index with the value at pointer, and move on to the next iteration. Value at index is not less than pivot, so we move on to the next iteration again. Value at index again is not less than pivot, and that we have now reached the end of our array, and we are now ready to place the pivot value in the array. So what we would do is we'll take the value at the pointer and swap it with the pivot value, which is the first value. And there you have it. All the values less than the pivot value, or that come before the pivot value, are less than it. All the values that come after the pivot value are greater than it. And you have finished the partition method.